Before we get started with this episode, I'm going to be talking about different locomotives using slightly technical terms. I'm going to talk about narrow gauge versus standard gauge, and I'll use the white notation for describing locomotive types with terms like 282 and 280. If you'd like a quick primer on the meanings of these terms, I have a previous video called An Introduction to Steam Train Terminology. I'll put a link in the show notes. One more quick note. I'll refer to the term tractive effort throughout this episode. Tractive effort is
the force in pounds exerted by powered equipment as a locomotive, as measured for statistical purposes at the rim of the driving wheels.
Welcome to Stories from the Midland. In this episode, we're exploring the Denver and Rio Grande Western's Engine 499, the railroad's K-37 class engines in general, and the conditions within the Denver and Rio Grande Western that led to their unique creation. April 20th, 2013 was a cold and cloudy day at Royal Gorge. Snow was still on the ground in places, and a steady but light breeze cut into exposed skin. I was standing in front of the display of Rio Grande Engine 499, wondering how I was going to take a picture of it. It was behind a short fence with a sign telling people not to cross it, so my options were limited. I had my Nikon D800, to which I had attached a 24mm fully manual prime lens. The wide angle made the engine feel like it was bearing down on the viewer, and the darkly cloudy sky almost gave a malevolent feel to the whole scene. It was the first serious train picture I ever took, and to this day it remains one of my favorite pictures that I've ever taken. And now it hangs proudly in my house, a 24 by 36 inch print in a beautiful exotic wood frame my sister specially made for it. Unfortunately, in June 2013, wildfires swept through the Royal Gorge Park. While the locomotive and its tender survived, the doghouse on top of the tender was burned away, and the caboose, it was a total loss.
God was good to make the mountains, the valleys, and the hills, put the rose upon the cactus, the ripple on the rills. But if I had all the words of all the worlds at my command, I couldn't paint a picture of the Canyon of the Grand. Cy Warman, from a Denver and Rio Grande advertisement.
The Denver and Rio Grande began laying narrow gauge track to penetrate the Rocky Mountains in 1871. By 1881, the D&RG reached just about every productive location in Colorado and into New Mexico and Utah. In 1881, the railroad began to convert tracks between Denver and Salt Lake City to create a standard gauge line between the two cities, creating the main line. Of course, with the D&RG's expansion into standard gauge service came standard gauge locomotives. Among them were 280 consolidations built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works for the D&RG Railway, which began service in 1902. But over the next 25 years, the railroad would deal with financially turbulent times, leading to sometimes drastic action in order to survive and improve service. Beginning in the late 1880s and into the silver mining crash of the 1890s, the D&RG found itself in financial trouble. One of the results was that for the next several decades, the railway didn't purchase any new narrow gauge locomotives to serve its still existing narrow gauge tracks. But those tracks still saw a lot of traffic, especially considering they served area where oil had been recently discovered and was being developed. Finally, in 1903, the D&RG ordered 15 narrow-gauge 282 Mikado locomotives to provide service to those high-demand areas. These were the first outside frame locomotives, locomotives with their structural frames outside of the driving wheels for the railroad. So you understand the difference between the original frame design for narrow-gauge locomotives and outside frames, have a look at this photograph of the Florence and Cripple Creek engine number 23. Look at the boiler, the long cylindrical part at the front of the engine, and its relation to the wheels it sits on. The wheels are flush with, or maybe a little outside of, the sides of the boiler. Next, look at the overall locomotive and comparative size of the engineer leaning out of the cab and the fireman just behind him. Now, keeping those things in mind, have a look at this picture of the Denver and Rio Grande Western engine number 499. The wheels appear tucked up under the boiler, and the whole engine is much larger, especially when you compare it to the men standing next to it. This is outside frame construction, and it meant that narrow gauge locomotives could be larger and heavier than they were in the past. Following the 1903 purchase of outside frame Mikados, all newly ordered narrow gauge D&RG engines would be built on outside frames. The next new locomotives like this would be ordered 19 years later, with less expensive used locomotives bought to fill in during the intervening time. This was brought on because of additional financial problems, a lot of which were created when the federal government took over the country's railroad for World War I. The federal government demonstrated its normal lack of agility in its administration over the railroads. They were a primary cause of the death of the Colorado Midland, and they drove the D&RG into receivership and eventually into foreclosure proceedings. The feds abused the railroads badly without providing for its maintenance and repair. After World War I and the direct control of the federal government over the railroads, the D&RG had to put a great deal of effort into its recovery. And with all of that hard work to recover from federal mismanagement, the D&RG's commercial traffic levels eventually began to rise. In October 1924, the Denver and Rio Grande reorganized as a Denver and Rio Grande Western. It began to aggressively improve its entire railroad system, both narrow and standard gauge. A few years prior, in 1922, as the D&RG was dealing with the looming foreclosure, the feds chose this time to order major improvements of all rail lines. Part of this was the purchase of 10 282 Mikado locomotives. They were again built on outside frames. These newer, faster, and more modern and efficient locomotives convinced the railroad's management that similar but more powerful engines would benefit the railroad's bottom line. After the Denver and Rio Grande's reorganization into the Denver and Rio Grande Western in 1924, the railroad purchased 10 more 282 outside frame narrow gauge locomotives in 1925. The newly organized D&RGW designated these engines as the K-39 class. The K was shorthand for the 282 configuration, maybe the K in Mikado, and the 36 signified the engine's 36,000 pounds of tractive effort. The railroad announced that with these new locomotives, the D&RGW would begin to retire its older and less efficient 280 narrow gauge engines. But narrow gauge traffic continued to increase, and more locomotives were needed. The D&RGW decided to build these new engines itself and began the process of backward engineering the K-36s. Now, as the railroad needed to build its new locomotives, it turned to its aging fleet of standard gauge engines for materials. Earlier, I mentioned the purchase of 280 engines built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1902. When the D&RGW was organized, they reclassified these locomotives as C41. The C stood for consolidation, the nickname given to the 280 wheel arrangement, and the 41 signified the engine's 41,000 pounds of tractive effort. Using the engineering they gleaned from backwards engineering the K-36 engines, including the outside frames, the D&RGW's Burnham shops, located just south of Denver, disassembled 6 280s and from them built the new locomotives. They actually started with new 282 narrow gauge outside frames that were provided wheels, axles, and other accessories. Onto this, they added the old 280 boiler, cab, and tender, as well as other components. This became the D&RGW's Class K-37 engine, again with the K signifying Mikado, or 282 wheel arrangement, and the 37 standing for the newly created locomotive's 37,000 pounds of tractive effort. Those first 6 were completed in 1928 and numbered 490 through 495. Once built, the locomotives were tested and then partially disassembled for transport to Alamosa, about 83 straight line miles southwest of Pueblo, and at Alamosa the engines were reassembled and provided the final checks and services needed to put them into operation. The K-37s were a success, so 4 more were built by 1930 and designated engines 496 through 499. These would be the last and largest locomotives to serve on Colorado's narrow gauge railroads. Among its fellow K-37s, locomotive 499 started its service life running between Alamosa and Durango over Cumbres Pass. K-37s would go on to also provide service between Salida and Gunnison, as well as on the Crested Butte, Monarch, and Farmington branches. In September of 1949, a picture of the 499 hauling the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club Special up Poncha Pass out of the San Luis Valley can be found in the Denver Public Library's digital collection. This train was scheduled for railroad enthusiasts from Golden. It was advertised as starting in Salida, traveling over Monarch Pass, then to Villa Grove in the San Luis Valley, and then returning. This suggests to me that by that time, engine 499 was stationed out of Salida to run the Salida to Gunnison route and had been specifically tasked for this excursion. If you have a different understanding, please let me know in the comments. 499 was finally retired in 1970. It sat unused at the Alamosa Roundhouse until it was sold to the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad in 1981 for display purposes. In 1999, it was traded over to the Royal Gorge Park as an exchange for their K-36 engine number 486. 499 was placed on display just south of the parking lot overlooking the Arkansas River. The static display was made up of the locomotive, its tender with its doghouse on top, and a caboose. But on June 11, 2013, a wildfire started about a mile outside Canyon City and spread into the Royal Gorge Park, burning about 90% of the land. The park was forced to announce an indefinite closure, but it opened again in 2015, and though the caboose and the doghouse on the tender were lost to the fire, the engine itself and the tender survived and can still be seen today. Thank you for listening. This is Tommy Allen wishing you a great day. And should you find yourself looking for the ultimate example of recycling, the C-41 conversion to the K-37 should do the trick. I look forward to having you join me next time for more stories from the Midland. Do 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 do. The Denver and Rio Grande began laying narrow gauge. The Denver and Rio Grande began. Oh boy. Now, keeping those things in mind, have a look at this picture of the Denver and Rio Grande Western's engine. Now, keeping those things in mind, have a look. The next new locomotives like this would be. Earlier, I mentioned the purchase of 280 locomotives by. Earlier, I mentioned the purchase of 280 locomotives built by the the C-41 blah blah blah. All right, so let's see if that do it. That looks like it should do it.